Las Vegas, mid-1970s. Elvis Presley, still the world's most recognizable voice, steps onto the stage in a glittering jumpsuit, flashing his signature smile to thousands of cheering fans. But behind the lights and applause, his body is sending urgent warnings he can no longer ignore. His heart racing, his hands trembling, the weight of exhaustion pressing down like a vice. In the sterile calm of a backstage office, the doctor speaks plainly for the first time. "If you don't stop now, Elvis, your career is over. Maybe even your life." The words hang in the air, heavier than any spotlight. This isn't just a story of fame fading or fame's excesses catching up. It's a man standing at the edge of mortality, already mourned by the world as if he were gone, wrestling with whether to surrender or rise. And then, in that same moment, he makes a choice. One that will silence the doubts of millions and make the universe hold its breath, reminding everyone that some voices, no matter the danger, refuse to be muted. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The backstage of the Hilton in Las Vegas carried an air of calculated chaos, the kind that only a performer of global renown could summon nightly. In the dimly lit corridors, the hum of technicians tuning instruments, stagehands shuffling props, and the faint scent of cigarette smoke mixed with floral cologne created a world entirely separate from the glamorous spotlight outside. Here, behind heavy velvet curtains, Elvis Presley moved like a ghost in his own life. Though he would soon walk onto a stage packed with thousands of expectant eyes, tonight his body betrayed him in ways that had begun to demand attention, ways he had tried for years to ignore. He adjusted his sparkling white jumpsuit, the sequins catching the low light and reflecting a brilliance that belied his physical state. His hands trembled ever so slightly as he zipped the costume up over his chest, feeling the weight of his own exhaustion settle like lead across his ribs. Sweat clung stubbornly to his hairline, and every breath felt labored, shallow. The applause waiting beyond the curtains was a phantom pressure pressing against his chest. It had always been a source of exhilaration, a driving force, but now it felt like a vice. "Elvis, you okay in there?" asked Joe Esposito, his longtime friend and road manager, peering around the dressing room door with worry etched into his weathered features. "Just fine, Joe," Elvis muttered, attempting a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He pressed a hand to his chest, pretending to adjust a mic pack that wasn't there, his mind running through the night's set list, calculating each note, each step, each breath. Moments later, Dr. Nick, the physician who had been monitoring Elvis's health quietly for years, stepped into the room, clipboard in hand, and a gravity that silenced the room instantly. His eyes were concerned but unflinching, and the weight of the news he carried pressed down like an unseen hand. "Elvis, we need to talk, Doctor," Nick said softly, but every word cut through the air sharper than any announcement ever could. Elvis froze mid-motion, his eyes narrowing slightly, a mixture of curiosity and fear. "Talk about what, Doc?" he asked, his voice steadier than he felt. "The lab results came back. Your heart rate is irregular, your liver function is compromised, and your blood pressure, well, you're dangerously high. You've been pushing it too far. You can't continue performing at this pace, not safely, not anymore." For a moment, the room held only the sound of a distant stage monitor humming faintly, like a heartbeat echoing in the corridors. Elvis blinked slowly, feeling the words sink into him with a weight that made the sequins on his jumpsuit shimmer in the harsh light. He had known this day was coming. He thought he had prepared himself, but standing there in that dressing room, the magnitude hit him like a punch he hadn't felt in years. I I can't just stop, he whispered, almost to himself, the familiar tremor in his voice betraying the panic he had worked so hard to hide. His body, though failing him, demanded the stage, the adoration, the music that had always been his lifeblood. Dr. Nick sighed, placing a steady hand on Elvis's shoulder. You have to consider it. One more tour like this, you might not get another. Joe Esposito shifted uncomfortably, his loyalty to Elvis battling with fear. He's still got 2 shows left this week, Joe murmured, unsure whether to argue or defer to the doctor. I know, doctor, Nick said quietly, his tone now edged with a dangerous clarity. But if you go out there tonight, if you push your body beyond this, it could be the last time anyone hears you sing. Elvis closed his eyes, letting the quiet hum of the dressing room and the faint, distant murmur of the crowd seep into him. Every concert, every roar of the audience, every flash of cameras had once been pure joy. Now it felt like a gamble, one that could cost him more than just applause. Yet, despite the warning, a fire ignited in him, a stubborn, almost defiant pulse. The stage was not just a place of performance. It was his sanctuary, his identity, his escape from every fear and failure that had stalked him for decades. To step away would be to admit that the body could dictate the end of what his spirit refused to relinquish. He opened his eyes slowly, the glint of determination mingling with the exhaustion on his face. I'll go out there, he said finally. The words were quiet but resolute, carrying with them the weight of both courage and despair. Doctor, Nick and Joe exchanged glances, a mixture of awe and terror in their expressions. This was the man who had thrilled the world, whose music had become the soundtrack of a generation. Yet he stood at the precipice of his own fragility, choosing to leap anyway. As Elvis turned toward the stage, the bright lights of the performance hall casting long shadows across the dressing room, he felt the pulse of expectation like a physical force against his chest. The audience had no idea of the battle raging behind the curtains, the silent struggle between fame, mortality, and an unquenchable desire to sing. And yet, as the first notes of the opening song prepared to erupt into the cavernous space beyond the velvet drapes, Elvis Presley, the king, braced himself. He would step into the light, a shimmering figure against the darkness, knowing that each moment on that stage might be borrowed time, but refusing to let fear dictate the music, refusing to surrender the very essence of who he was. The night had begun, and with it, a struggle that no one outside these walls could yet comprehend. The room was quiet, except for the distant echo of applause that drifted faintly from the stage, a reminder of the life Elvis had committed himself to and the price he was silently paying for it. He sank into the worn armchair near the window of his Las Vegas Hilton suite, the golden records on the wall catching reflections of the neon lights from the strip below. Each one represented triumph, each one a testament to his relentless drive. But tonight, they felt less like symbols of achievement and more like chains, heavy and unforgiving. Elvis ran a hand over his face, feeling the coarse stubble on his jaw, and his thoughts drifted back to a simpler time, back to Memphis. He remembered the warm, sunlit mornings at Graceland, the smell of biscuits and coffee wafting through the kitchen, and the sound of his mother's voice calling him to breakfast. He remembered sitting in the pews of the small church near his home, singing hymns with an innocence that made the notes rise effortlessly, as if they were already part of him. The contrast between those days and this, his body caged in sequins, his voice strained, his heart laboring, was sharp, almost unbearable. He picked up a pen and a sheet of paper, intending to write a letter to his fans. The words began to form in his mind, tentative at first, then growing bolder. "Dear friends, I've always given you my heart." He stopped mid-sentence, staring at the paper as if the act of writing could somehow make it real. The idea that he might have to tell them that the music, the lifeblood of his existence, might not come as easily anymore. He couldn't bring himself to finish it. The thought of surrendering to the limitations of his own body felt like betraying every note he had ever sung. Around him, the room felt alive with tension. Members of his inner circle, his so-called Memphis Mafia, moved like shadows across the edges of the suite. Some spoke in low, urgent tones, their voices a mixture of fear and loyalty. "He can't keep going like this," one murmured. "He'll destroy himself if he doesn't slow down." Another countered sharply, "We can't let him stop. Not when the fans are waiting. Not when he's still capable of greatness." Elvis listened silently, the conflict gnawing at him. He had always been guided by the roar of the audience, the surge of adrenaline that carried him through each performance. And yet, now, the thrill felt dangerous, like stepping onto the edge of a cliff and expecting to fly. His mind flickered between memory and reality. The church hymns of his youth, the first guitar chords that made him feel alive, and the sterile, urgent warnings of Doctor Nick that lingered like a shadow over every thought. He leaned back, closing his eyes, and felt the weight of isolation settle on his shoulders. It was not loneliness in the conventional sense. He was surrounded by people who adored him, who protected him, who had followed his every step for decades, but a solitary kind of despair, the kind that only comes when the one you've always depended on, your own body, begins to betray you. "I don't know if I can," he murmured, voice barely audible even to himself. His hands rested on his knees, trembling slightly, and he could feel the faint pulse of his heartbeat in his temples, each beat a reminder that he was still alive, still capable, but dangerously fragile. Then came the first pangs of guilt. He thought of the audiences, thousands of people who had followed his career, who had grown up listening to him, singing along with his every note. He thought of the younger artists who looked up to him, of children in small towns across America who found solace in his music. How could he deny them this one thing, even if it meant risking his own life? A knock on the door pulled him back from the edge of his thoughts. It was Joe, returning, his expression carefully neutral, though the worry didn't quite hide behind it. "You've got to rest, Elvis. Seriously. Even one more night like tonight." He hesitated, not wanting to finish the sentence. Elvis shook his head slowly. "I can't. I won't. Not yet." The words came out firmer than he expected, carrying with them a defiance that startled even him. He had always been driven by music, by performance, but now the drive was tinged with desperation, a need to prove to himself that he was still capable, that he was still alive in the truest sense, not just in body, but in spirit. Arguments continued around him, whispered but sharp, the air thick with conflicting loyalty and fear. Some urged him to pause, to cancel, to retreat. Others insisted that a king never steps back, that greatness demands sacrifice, that the audience, his family in every sense that mattered, was counting on him. And somewhere deep inside, Elvis felt both sides, the tension coiling in his chest like a living thing. He thought of writing the letter again, but now it felt futile. Words on paper could never convey the storm inside him, the relentless push-pull of duty, desire, and fear. Music was action, not explanation. The stage was where his heart spoke loudest, where every note was a testament to resilience, to survival, to defiance. Finally, he rose from the chair, moving toward the mirror to face the man staring back at him. He looked gaunt, the spark of youth dimmed but not extinguished. He adjusted his hair, the sweat dampening his temples, and stared at his reflection as though searching for an answer in his own eyes. And in that reflection, he saw the truth he had always known, but had never had to confront so starkly. The music wasn't just his career, it was his life. To step away was to surrender a part of himself he could never reclaim. The decision crystallized silently, without fanfare, without external validation. He would go on. He would perform. But tonight, he would do it differently. Not for fame, not for the crowd, not even for the applause that had once defined him, but for the music itself, for the pure, unshakable heartbeat that had carried him from a small church in Memphis to stages across the world. And as he turned toward the hallway, the golden records on the walls catching the shifting neon light one last time, he felt a strange calm settle over him. The battle had not ended. It was only beginning. But for the first time in years, he understood that his struggle was not against the body that betrayed him, nor the audience that expected him, nor even the relentless passage of time. It was against the surrender of his own spirit. He would sing, no matter what. The day began with an uneasy quiet that seemed almost unnatural for Las Vegas, a city built on noise, lights, and spectacle. Elvis awoke before dawn, the soft hum of the strip below barely audible through the thick drapes of his Hilton suite. The events of the previous night, the warnings, the internal debates, the sleepless hours of contemplation, still clung to him like a second skin. He moved to the desk by the window, where sheets of music and notes were scattered, remnants of rehearsals that had lately demanded more of him than he could give. For a long time, he sat silently, hands clasped in front of him, staring out at the flickering neon and the tiny, indistinct figures moving in the streets below. He could feel the pulse of the city, relentless and unapologetic, like the ticking of a clock that would not pause for anyone. And within him, the tension between fear and compulsion burned brighter than ever. He knew his body was fragile, that the warnings were not hyperbole. And yet, the thought of surrendering, of leaving the stage, of letting the applause fade into memory, was unbearable. By mid-morning, his decision had begun to take shape, sharp and undeniable. He would go on. But this time, he would not perform as he had for decades, dazzling the crowd with spectacle and charisma alone. This time, he would strip the performance to its essence, to something raw, something deeply personal. The first song would not be a chart-topping hit, nor a playful romp designed to incite cheers. It would be a hymn, a declaration of vulnerability and faith. "How great thou art," he whispered to himself, the words tasting strange yet comforting on his tongue. It had been years since he had sung it publicly, and yet, in his mind, the melody came alive as if waiting for him. He moved through the suite, picking up his guitar, fingers tracing the familiar frets and strings. The wood felt solid, reassuring under his calloused hands. He began to strum quietly, the notes echoing softly off the walls, a tentative prelude to what he would attempt on stage. For a moment, he allowed himself a fleeting smile, thinking of the audiences he had thrilled for so long, of the faces, of the countless hands reaching out, of the energy that had always seemed infinite. But that joy was tempered by the knowledge of what he risked tonight. One misstep, one fainting spell, and it would not be a triumphant story. It could be the end. The rehearsals that afternoon were tense, almost unbearable. His band noticed immediately the difference in his demeanor. The usual playful banter was absent, replaced by a quiet intensity that seemed to emanate from his very bones. He moved through the familiar arrangements with care, stopping mid-verse, hands resting on his knees, eyes closed as he listened to the sound of his own voice, raw and trembling at first. A bead of sweat slid down his temple, and he felt his legs weaken, a sudden heaviness that made him stagger slightly. "Take a break," Joe advised firmly, stepping forward with a hand on his shoulder. "You can't push yourself like this." "I'm fine," Elvis said, his voice quieter than intended, yet resolute. "If I fall on stage. That's where I belong." The room went silent. The statement was not arrogance. It was truth. His team, accustomed to his bravado, recognized the gravity in his tone. There was no room for debate tonight. This was his choice, fully owned, fully realized. He would not back down, not for fear, not for caution, not even for the body that protested with every note. The afternoon stretched into evening. The lights dimmed in the rehearsal hall, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. Elvis continued, each chord a testament to both frailty and resolve, each note a challenge to the limits imposed upon him. Somewhere deep inside, beyond the fatigue, beyond the pain, a sense of clarity emerged. This performance would not be about defiance alone. It would be about connection, about opening a door to the audience, to his fans, to every listener who had ever found solace or joy in his music. By the time he left the rehearsal hall, dusk had settled over the city. He walked slowly back to his suite, the weight of the upcoming night pressing on him like a tangible force. He paused in front of the mirror in the hallway, staring at his reflection. Not the reflection of a star, but of a man confronting his own mortality and choosing action regardless. The sequined jacket hung loosely over his shoulders, a reminder of the public persona he would soon inhabit once more. But beneath it was the core truth. The music and the need to perform outweighed every fear. Dinner was quiet. His team spoke in hushed tones, careful not to disturb the fragile equilibrium. Elvis ate slowly, methodically, each bite a small ritual, a grounding act to prepare for what was coming. Thoughts of the fans, the children, the lonely and grieving who had sent letters seeking hope, circulated in his mind, intensifying the weight of responsibility he felt. It was no longer a choice merely of pride or fame. It was a moral imperative, a sacred duty he felt compelled to honor. Hours later, in the dim glow of his suite, Elvis sat on the edge of the bed, guitar in hand once more. He played through the hymn slowly, each chord a lifeline, each note a silent conversation with every soul he had ever touched. And as the city below pulsed with neon lights and the distant sounds of traffic, a certainty crystallized in him, as unshakable as the first chord he had ever strummed. Tonight, he would not merely perform. He would bear his spirit, fragile yet unyielding, before the eyes of the world. And in doing so, he would stake everything, not his life alone, but the essence of who he was, the very heartbeat of his existence, on a single, trembling, extraordinary moment of truth. The night had arrived with a heaviness that pressed down on every street, every building of the Las Vegas Strip, as though the city itself sensed the weight of what was to come. The marquee outside the Hilton shone like a beacon, gold letters proclaiming Elvis Presley Live. Yet behind the glittering facade, tension coiled tightly around the performers, the crew, and most of all, the man who would walk onto the stage. Elvis lingered in his suite, the hum of the hotel almost comforting, almost protective. He dressed slowly, each button fastened with deliberate care, each layer of costume a ritual that grounded him in the familiar while simultaneously reminding him of the fragility beneath. The sequins glittered under the dim lighting, but they could not mask the pallor of his skin or the slight tremor in his hands. Yet his eyes, those wide, expressive eyes that had captivated millions, burned with a quiet resolve, a fierce determination to confront the night on his own terms. As the elevators descended, carrying him to the stage, the familiar chaos of the backstage corridors assaulted his senses. Stagehands scurried past with microphones and cords, costume assistants clutched racks of glittering jackets, and the band warmed up, each note echoing in the narrow space. For a fleeting moment, a pang of doubt flickered across Elvis's mind, but it was immediately smothered by the purpose that had brought him this far. This was not just a performance, it was a declaration, a defiance, and a testament to the force of human will. The auditorium waited. More than 2,000 souls had gathered, a sea of faces and voices, anticipation crackling in the heavy air. Reporters jostled for the best angles, cameras clicking and whirring, eager to capture every detail. The lights dimmed, a hush spreading across the crowd like the tide retreating before a storm. And then the moment came. The announcer's voice cut through the silence, declaring the entrance of Elvis Presley. He did not rush. There was no sudden burst of fanfare, no dramatic spotlight revealing a figure spinning or leaping. Instead, he walked steadily from the wings, his movements measured, his presence commanding without ostentation. The audience's initial confusion gave way to curiosity, their whispers a soft ripple through the packed hall. As he reached center stage, he paused, taking a deep breath, fingers brushing the microphone. And in that pause, the room seemed to hold its collective breath. Then, with a voice at first tentative and quiet, he began, "How great thou art." The opening notes were almost fragile, a stark contrast to the explosive entrances fans had come to expect. Some in the audience frowned, unsure, whispering to their neighbors, questioning the choice. Yet within moments, the spell began to weave itself. The sincerity in his tone, the vulnerability etched into every phrase, drew the attention of all. Cameras captured the slight quiver in his lips, the gentle sway of his body, and the subtle rise and fall of his chest as he poured every ounce of himself into the hymn. As he sang, the atmosphere shifted. The ordinary sound of coughs, whispers, and shuffling feet faded into reverent silence. Eyes glistened with unshed tears, and hands, hesitant at first, began to clap softly in rhythm, not as a call for spectacle, but as a recognition of the sacred intensity before them. The hall, so often filled with noise and commercial energy, had transformed into a space of solemn communion, a testament to the human spirit and its capacity to reach beyond the physical into something transcendent. Elvis's voice grew stronger with each line, trembling less and resonating more, filling the hall with a warmth that belied the frailty of his body. He leaned into the melody, closed his eyes, and allowed himself to become not just a performer, but a conduit, a vessel carrying the hopes, grief, and devotion of thousands of listeners. He was not merely singing, he was offering a lifeline, a reminder that even in weakness, there could be beauty and strength intertwined. Backstage, the crew watched with bated breath. The band followed his lead, every chord precisely timed, every note attuned to the subtleties of his interpretation. Even the skeptics, those who had expected collapse or disaster, were forced to silence, witnessing a man defy the predictions of physics and biology with sheer will. And somewhere in the wings, the doctor who had warned him moments before, eyes wide and unblinking, realized he was seeing something extraordinary. A living paradox of vulnerability and invincibility intertwined. The song neared its end, and Elvis opened his eyes, scanning the audience, feeling the weight and the gratitude of their attention. The final chords rang out, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath. And then the applause came, first tentative, then swelling into a roaring tide that threatened to drown out the very walls of the theater. Fans leaped to their feet, voices calling his name, tears streaming, hands clapping, crying, reaching, touching the space between artist and audience in a shared act of awe and reverence. For Elvis, the reaction was both exhilarating and exhausting. Sweat gleamed on his brow, his chest heaving with each breath, and his legs trembled beneath him. Yet the joy, the profound connection, the undeniable proof that he had reached through the chaos and the frailty to touch something eternal, made every ache, every warning from his body, worth enduring. He bowed low, long and deliberate, acknowledging the communion that had formed, the miracle of the human spirit reflected back at him in the faces of strangers. And as he stepped off stage, guided by the careful hands of his assistants, he felt a quiet thrill mixed with exhaustion, a knowledge that what had begun as a simple decision to sing differently had transformed into something far larger. It was no longer merely a show, it was a declaration of life, a statement against surrender, a revelation that courage could manifest not in spectacle alone, but in vulnerability, in truth, in the act of risking everything for the love of an audience that had become family in ways words could not describe. As the first notes of "How Great Thou Art" settled into the hushed auditorium, a fragile tension gripped the air, almost tangible, like the faint scent of dust before a storm. Elvis's voice had started with a tremor, almost imperceptible, a wavering thread of sound that betrayed the toll of years, exhaustion, and the medications that coursed through his veins. For a moment, it seemed as though the human vessel on stage might falter under the weight of expectation, and yet there was a light flickering in his eyes, a spark of determination that refused to be extinguished. Every breath he drew was a negotiation with his body. His legs, though trembling, bore him across the stage with a measured grace, his sequined jacket catching the light in quiet bursts, as though each glimmer were a pulse of the life force he refused to surrender. His hands, delicate and slightly shaking, gripped the microphone not out of desperation, but with a reverence for the moment and for the audience who had come expecting a spectacle, and were instead witnessing something far more profound. The initial lines of the hymn were met with a stunned silence. Audience members glanced around, unsure of how to react. Some furrowed brows in confusion, others exchanged uncertain whispers. But gradually, the subtle beauty of his delivery began to weave a spell. The frailty in his voice was not weakness. It was intimacy, a bridge connecting performer and listener in a shared acknowledgement of vulnerability. The congregation of 2,000 souls became a single entity, leaning in, holding its breath, collectively surrendering to the raw emotion being offered to them. Then, something shifted. As Elvis continued, the trembling in his voice steadied, each note growing in strength, in clarity, as though the very act of singing was drawing energy from the collective heartbeat of the crowd. His body, though fatigued, seemed to respond to the resonance of the hymn, and a rhythm emerged, not a rhythm of dance or performance, but of spirit, of something elemental. His eyes, now closed, reflected a deep communion, a silent conversation with the divine and with every soul in the hall. The audience's reaction evolved in real time. Initial uncertainty melted into awe. Hands moved to chests, gripping, holding, feeling the vibration of each note resonate inside them. Tears welled in eyes, trickled down cheeks, and mouths formed small, reverent O's. No one dared speak, not out of fear, but out of recognition that words were inadequate, that this moment demanded only presence, only absorption of the gift unfolding before them. Cameras clicked with cautious respect, the flashes softer now, careful not to break the delicate spell that had fallen over the room. Backstage, the atmosphere was electric yet tense. Stagehands exchanged glances, knowing that what they were witnessing was a deviation from every rehearsal, every expectation. And yet, it was undeniably mesmerizing. Musicians followed him with a delicate precision, each strum of guitar, each drum beat perfectly attuned to his voice, as if sensing the fragility of the moment and seeking to protect it. Even the producer, who had doubted this shift from spectacle to spiritual performance, found himself gripping the edge of the balcony, captivated, understanding that something monumental was unfolding. Halfway through the song, Elvis's voice underwent another transformation. The frailty fell away completely, replaced by a strength that seemed almost impossible given his condition. The hall erupted, not in noise, but in an eruption of shared recognition. He hit a high note with controlled power that made the very air vibrate. It was a triumph not of technical mastery, but of courage, of defiance against the limitations his body imposed. The silence was now charged with electricity, the kind that lingers in the spine long after the sound has faded. Fans, who had come for the flash and glamour of a Presley show, were transfixed. Some cried openly, their sobs soft but insistent. Others clutched the hands of neighbors, needing contact, needing confirmation that this was real, that this man, so fragile in appearance, could summon such strength. A few of the skeptics who had whispered doubts were now unable to look away, their pens frozen over notebooks, their cameras lowered, as if to not disturb the fragile miracle. Even the doctor who had warned him against performing watched in silent astonishment. The stern, clinical detachment that had defined his earlier assessment was gone, replaced by awe. The human body, so often predictable in its failings, had surrendered to something more profound, an indomitable will, a force of spirit that defied medical logic. "I never," the doctor whispered, almost to himself, unable to complete the thought, as the impossible unfolded in front of him. As the final lines approached, the energy in the room shifted from anticipation to celebration. Elvis leaned slightly forward, shoulders hunched in exhaustion yet unwavering, letting the last notes ripple through the auditorium like the gentle crest of a wave. The hymn concluded, and for a brief moment, silence returned, heavy and complete, as if the room collectively processed the magnitude of what had just occurred. And then, applause. It began softly, almost shyly, but quickly swelled into a torrent of sound that engulfed the theater. 2,000 voices rose in unison, clapping, cheering, shouting his name. Fans leapt to their feet, waving hands, some weeping, some laughing in disbelief. The room vibrated with a joy so profound it seemed to shake the foundations of the building itself. Cameras flashed, capturing every expression, every tear, every look of uncontainable admiration. The performance was over, yet the echo lingered, a palpable presence, a testament to the power of resilience and artistry. Elvis stood for a moment, breathing heavily, letting the applause wash over him. His chest heaved, muscles quivering, yet his eyes shone with a quiet triumph. He had risked everything: the stability of his body, the judgment of critics, the fear of failure, and emerged not only unbroken, but exalted. He bowed deeply, allowing himself a rare, private smile that acknowledged both the danger he had faced and the miracle he had created. The magic of the moment did not reside solely in the song. It lived in the connection, in the shared recognition that vulnerability and strength were not opposites, but companions. That courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to move forward despite it. And as the applause continued to roar, resonating through his body and soul, Elvis knew that tonight had become more than a performance. It had become a testament, a declaration, a lifeline thrown across the chasm between artist and audience, a bridge built from pure human will. The morning after the performance arrived with an unusual clarity, as if the world itself had paused to process the previous night's miracle. Sunlight poured through the blinds of Elvis's Las Vegas suite, spilling across the floor in long golden streaks, yet it felt subdued compared to the resonance of the night before. The air outside carried the faint hum of traffic, the low murmur of a city that usually never slept, but inside, everything seemed suspended. The events of yesterday could not be contained within walls or memory. They were already spilling outward, beyond the hotel, beyond the city, into the nation's consciousness. By mid-morning, the first newspapers hit the stands. The headlines were audacious in their celebration. Elvis resurrected. The voice defies fate. Miracle in Las Vegas. Presley triumphs against the odds. Editors who had expected scandal, who had predicted decline, now scrambled to capture the nuance, the enormity of what had transpired. Photographs of Elvis on stage, his sequined jacket gleaming, his posture both fragile and unyielding, dominated the front pages, each frame telling a story of resilience that words alone could scarcely contain. The language of the press shifted almost overnight, from critique to reverence. The narrative was no longer about decline, but about revival, about the undeniable force of a human spirit refusing to bow to limitations. Inside Graceland, the response was equally electric. Fan mail poured in by the hundreds, stacks of envelopes covering desks and overflowing trash bins, a flood of gratitude, awe, and personal testimony. Letters came from every corner of the country, small towns, sprawling cities, remote communities. One woman wrote of sitting beside her dying husband, holding his hand as Elvis's hymn poured through their radio, describing it as a lifeline in the darkness of fear and grief. Another letter arrived from a young man recovering from a debilitating injury, who credited the performance with giving him courage to face the painful months ahead. Each envelope was more than a message. It was a story, a testament, a connection that bridged the distance between performer and listener, uniting them in shared vulnerability and resilience. Even the medical community could not ignore the ripple. The doctor who had warned Elvis about the dangers of continuing to perform now faced a reckoning of his own. In private, he confessed his astonishment, repeatedly shaking his head in disbelief. "I've seen many patients fight," he admitted to a colleague, "but I've never witnessed something like this. Not merely survival, but triumph. The will, the determination, it's extraordinary." By afternoon, snippets of his acknowledgement leaked to the press, adding an almost mythic layer to the story. The man who once cautioned restraint now validated the impossible. Elvis had achieved not only survival, but transcendence, a feat that no medication, no prognosis had predicted. Radio stations joined the chorus. DJs replayed segments of the performance, dissecting every note, every phrase, analyzing how a voice so fragile moments earlier could gain such momentum, such depth. Call-in lines overflowed with listeners recounting the personal impact. Parents who had wept silently while their children slept. Workers who had taken a rare break just to hear the hymn in real time. Strangers who found comfort in a voice they could not see but felt with every fiber of their being. The collective response was overwhelming, a societal exhale acknowledging the raw humanity behind the spectacle and the unquantifiable power of art to heal, inspire, and transform. television producers began to strategize. Clips from the performance were quickly requested for national broadcasts, the camera angles carefully curated to capture both the intimacy and the grandeur of the moment. Interviews with attendees painted a portrait of a shared awakening. People who had come expecting entertainment were instead witnesses to a living miracle, their emotions laid bare on camera. Reporters spoke of the performance with reverence, their words tinged with disbelief, awe, and respect. One broadcaster described the audience's reaction as a congregation of humanity recognizing the divine in the ordinary. Another spoke of the powerful paradox, a man weakened by his own body, yet elevated by his spirit, capable of moving thousands in a single moment. Amidst this public reckoning, Elvis himself retreated briefly into private reflection. The flood of attention was relentless, yet he remained detached, listening quietly to reports, scanning letters, reading excerpts from newspapers. He felt both buoyed and burdened by the recognition, pride and exhaustion entwined in a complicated knot within his chest. Each message, each headline, reinforced the truth that the night had been extraordinary, but it also reminded him of the precarious balance between triumph and the fragility of life. The applause, the accolades, the awe, all were fleeting unless he continued to navigate the delicate interface between body, mind, and artistry. By evening, the world's perception of him had shifted irrevocably. Those who had once whispered that Elvis's best days were behind him now spoke of him as a symbol, a beacon, a man whose voice had carried more than melody. It had carried courage, hope, and an enduring testament to the power of perseverance. From the quiet corners of the nation to the bustling streets of New York, Los Angeles, and Memphis, discussions of the performance became social currency. Cafes, diners, offices, and homes buzzed with anecdotes of the concert, each retelling emphasizing the improbable rise from fragility to glory, the quiet drama of a human being choosing to act despite the shadows looming over him. Even the skeptics, critics who had often written scathing reviews or questioned his stamina, found themselves reluctantly altered in perspective. Some privately admitted that the performance had moved them to tears. Others scribbled in notebooks, acknowledging the courage required to step onto a stage, knowing the risks. The universal acknowledgement was inescapable. Last night had transcended entertainment. It had become a cultural touchstone, an emblem of human resilience and artistic integrity. By the time night descended on Las Vegas once more, the city seemed to hum in resonance with the event, as if the lights of the Strip itself had absorbed fragments of that power. Newspapers had been read, radio segments replayed, letters filed and responded to. And yet, the true impact lingered in the quiet moments, the moments when individuals sat alone, replaying the hymn in their minds, reflecting on personal struggles, and finding unexpected courage. In ways both intimate and immense, the world had collectively absorbed the message. The voice that refused to be silenced had reminded them all that hope, once awakened, could not easily be contained. The story of Elvis's night in Las Vegas was no longer merely a tale of a performer. It had become an emblem, a narrative that stretched beyond music into human experience, echoing a singular truth, that even in the face of the most unrelenting odds, spirit and determination could redefine what was possible. Newspapers would archive it, radio would replay it, fans would cherish it, but the essence, the raw emotional heartbeat, would belong to each listener individually, stitched forever into memory as an enduring testament to the night when a voice became more than sound, and a man became more than mortal. After the initial wave of media frenzy and the tidal surge of fan letters had subsided, Elvis found himself alone in the dimly lit suite of his Las Vegas hotel. The evening air had grown cool, drifting in through the slightly ajar balcony door, carrying the distant hum of traffic and the faint buzz of neon lights from the strip below. It was a rare moment of quiet in a life that had lately felt like a relentless whirlwind, and in this fragile calm, the full weight of what he had accomplished began to press down on him. The applause, the accolades, the breathless reports in the newspapers, they were all intoxicating, but they had not yet touched the deeper reality of his exhaustion, nor the toll that each note had taken on his body. He sank into the armchair near the window, gazing at the glow of the city stretching infinitely beneath him. The room felt unusually large, and yet claustrophobic, as if the walls themselves were pressing in with the unspoken expectations of the world. The triumphant notes of "How great thou art" still echoed in his mind, each phrase replaying like a looped film reel, highlighting not only his victory, but the fragility of the vessel that had delivered it. For a moment, he closed his eyes and listened to the silence, the kind of silence that hums with anticipation, the unsteady calm between storms. His body, every muscle weighted with fatigue, ached from exertion. His hands trembled slightly, a residual reminder of what had been demanded of him, and his chest felt tight, as if the simple act of breathing required effort. The conversation with his medical team from the night before returned vividly to his memory. "Every performance pushes you closer to the edge," the doctor had warned. "This isn't sustainable." And yet, here he was, having not only performed but triumphed in a way that defied logic and expectation. The paradox gnawed at him, a body in rebellion, a voice rising above the limitations imposed by its host. It was a victory, yes, but one shadowed by the knowledge that the margin for error was razor-thin. Even now, the quiet aftermath carried the threat of collapse, the possibility that this triumph might be the last of its kind. The phone on the desk buzzed insistently, jolting him from introspection. It was Lisa Marie. Her small, familiar voice filtered through the line, tentative yet filled with the warmth only a child could convey. "Daddy," she said softly, "will you be at my birthday?" The simplicity of the question struck him like a blow. The calendar he kept meticulously, the tour schedule, the rehearsals, they all seemed to shrink suddenly under the weight of the human stakes, the bonds of family that no amount of music or fame could replace. He hesitated, words caught in a knot of longing, responsibility, and exhaustion. The answer would not be simple. Each yes carried a risk, each no carried a cost. And in that silence, for longer than appropriate, he simply held the receiver, listening to her waiting breath, her trust hanging in the balance. Outside the window, the city lights shimmered like distant stars, indifferent to the human dramas unfolding within their reach. And yet, within the suite, the atmosphere was electric with tension. The members of his team, managers, assistants, and longtime friends, had gathered nearby, a muted council anxious and exhausted from the previous night. They spoke in hushed tones, exchanging worried glances. Suggestions of postponing future shows, scaling back the tour, even canceling dates entirely were offered. But each proposal met the same unyielding response: "I must perform. I must sing for them." It was not stubbornness born of ego. It was a compulsion, an imperative etched into the very core of his being. To withhold his voice was to deny a part of himself. As he sat there, the interplay between physical fragility and mental fortitude became starkly clear. The exhaustion in his bones, the ache in his lungs, the faint dizziness that threatened to unseat him at any moment, all contrasted sharply with the undiminished fire in his mind, the relentless desire to reach out, to connect, to share a piece of his soul with the world. It was a delicate balance, a perilous tightrope between life and art. Every past success, every accolade, every audience ovation suddenly felt like a contract he had signed with fate itself. To give everything, knowing well that the cost could be catastrophic. The suite, filled with the quiet shuffle of papers, the faint clatter of coffee cups, and the subdued murmurs of his entourage, became a crucible of internal struggle. He reflected on the faces of the audience the night before, the wide-eyed children, the teary-eyed adults, the elderly couples clutching each other in silent reverence. Each pair of eyes held a story, a piece of hope, a fragment of faith in a man they had watched falter and rise again. That memory, vivid and unyielding, drove a raw determination deep within him. The triumph on stage was not his alone. It belonged to them, and he could not, would not, forsake it. Hours passed in contemplative silence, punctuated only by the occasional sigh or the distant rumble of the city below. In these moments, the full cost of his choice, the decision to continue performing despite medical warnings, despite personal risk, became undeniable. It was not merely about music, it was about responsibility, legacy, and the fragile intersection of duty and desire. The juxtaposition of audience adoration and personal vulnerability created an emotional tension that was almost unbearable. Yet it was also sustaining, a paradoxical source of strength. By late night, Elvis stood once more at the balcony, staring out over Las Vegas. The neon lights reflected in his eyes, shimmering in a way that mirrored both exhaustion and resolve. Somewhere deep within, he understood the stakes. Each note sung, each performance given, was a gamble against time and mortality. And yet, as he inhaled the night air, he made a silent promise to himself and to the countless souls who had been moved by his voice. He would continue, for as long as he could, to sing. He would endure the pain, confront the fatigue, face the warnings, and rise again to the stage, because there was something far greater than his own body at play, a calling, a mission, a sacred trust to the people who listened, who believed, who found life in the vibration of his song. In that moment, the dichotomy between vulnerability and courage crystallized. The world saw a triumphant performer. He felt the weight of a human being navigating the impossible. The internal battle was far from over. It was only intensifying. But the flame within him, the unyielding determination to sing, to live, to connect, burned brighter than ever. And as the city hummed below, he whispered to himself, almost as if affirming a vow, "I will rise again, because they need me, and I need them." The days leading up to the next performance were taut with anticipation, a delicate tension that hummed through the corridors of the hotel and into every rehearsal room. Las Vegas itself seemed to hold its breath, the neon glow reflecting a city-wide expectation that almost matched the weight on Elvis's own shoulders. Tickets had sold out within hours, newspaper headlines demanded a spectacle, and fan letters poured in like torrents, each one a reminder that the world was watching, waiting, craving, and judging. The air backstage felt heavy, a mixture of nerves, cigarette smoke, and the lingering scent of last night's perfume from thousands of audience members. The musicians tuned their instruments with mechanical precision, every note a potential fracture line in the fragile structure of the night to come. Elvis sat quietly in his dressing room, draped in his familiar sequined jacket, its surface catching the faint light in the room like the shimmer of distant stars. He traced the stitching absent-mindedly, each pull and tug a meditation on the fine line between control and chaos. The mirror reflected a man who seemed both ageless and prematurely aged, whose eyes carried the fatigue of too many battles and yet burned with an unextinguishable fire. His hands rested lightly on his knees, but beneath the calm exterior, muscles twitched, and the tremor of tension was unmistakable. Every heartbeat echoed in his ears, a reminder that the next performance was not merely another show. It was a confrontation with fate itself. Minutes before stepping onto the stage, the doctor approached again. His expression was grave, and the words came out in a low, measured tone. "Elvis, I need you to understand. This could be fatal. One wrong move, one misstep in strain, and it could end everything." The voice was not accusatory, merely factual, a cold reminder that the rules of the body are indifferent to the will of the spirit. Elvis looked at him for a long moment, the quiet of the room amplifying the weight of the warning. The doctor's hand rested lightly on his shoulder, almost instinctively seeking to anchor him, to remind him that some lines should not be crossed. And then, with a steady inhale, Elvis met the gaze of the man who had been both a guide and a judge. "They think I should stop," he murmured, almost to himself. "They think my time is over. But how can I stop when my heart is still singing?" His words were a quiet defiance, yet inside, the uncertainty loomed like a shadow at the edge of a stage spotlight. He rose slowly, adjusting the jacket and stepping toward the door, feeling every ache, every strain, every pulse of tension in his body as a reminder of the stakes. The hall outside waited like a living organism, breathing in sync with the collective excitement of thousands, all unaware of the precariousness of the man who was about to command their attention. As he stepped onto the stage, the orchestra began a gentle prelude, yet Elvis paused. The audience, thousands of eyes and faces, leaned forward in expectation. He raised his hand slightly, halting the first chord of the music. The room fell into a silence so profound it almost seemed unnatural, a vacuum of sound punctuated only by the collective intake of breath from the crowd. "People think I must be silent," he said into the microphone, his voice resonant yet tinged with vulnerability. "But how can one be silent when the heart still has a song to sing?" There was no theatrics, no flamboyant entrance, just honesty, raw and exposed, hanging like a thread over the mass of waiting souls. The pause stretched long enough that some in the audience murmured nervously, unsure what was happening. Then, slowly, a single note emerged, low and reverent, carrying a tremor that was almost imperceptible, but humanly tangible. The song began not with spectacle, not with bravado, but with truth, each word deliberate, each phrase a bridge between a fragile body and an indomitable spirit. The tremble in his voice, far from a flaw, became a conduit for emotion, drawing the audience into a shared vulnerability. People leaned closer, as if proximity could protect them from the weight of what they were witnessing. As the song progressed, the tension in the room shifted. The trepidation transformed into awe. The audience, initially uncertain, began to sway subtly in unison, their collective heartbeat echoing the rhythm of the performance. The orchestra followed his lead, their music bending to the contours of his voice, amplifying the raw, emotional landscape. For a moment, it was as if time itself had paused. Walls, stage lights, cameras, and even personal fears melted away, leaving only the fragile human connection between singer and listener. Backstage, his team held their breath, observing through the partially opened curtains. The doctor's face was pale, yet his lips formed a tight line that betrayed an awe he had not intended to show. This was no longer merely a performance. It was a defiance of odds, a reclamation of life, a statement that the human spirit could, against reason, prevail. The risk was palpable, but the magnitude of what was being achieved eclipsed any fear of consequence. When the final note resonated, lingering and pure, the hall erupted in a deafening wave of applause, tears, and standing ovations. Cameras flashed incessantly, capturing every glint of sweat, every expression of concentrated triumph on his face. Elvis lowered his head slightly, feeling the surge of energy, relief, and exhilaration washing over him. He knew the danger had not passed. The body was still fragile, every step forward still a challenge. But at that moment, he allowed himself to absorb the enormity of the achievement. This was not merely another concert. It was a declaration that even in the shadow of mortality, choice, will, and courage could manifest as brilliance. The audience sensed it intuitively, connecting to a vulnerability that transformed into strength. Every gasp, every cheer, every tear reflected not just entertainment, but a shared human triumph. In the echo of the applause, Elvis understood that the risks he had taken were not in vain. His song had become more than music. It had become a testament, a living legacy of defiance, courage, and the irrepressible power of art to transcend limitations. And as the lights dimmed and the final echoes faded, a quiet satisfaction settled within him. The struggle would continue. The warnings would persist. The body would still demand its toll. But in that night, in that fragile and fleeting moment, Elvis had once more reminded the world, and himself, that the heart could still sing even when the body trembled. The aftermath of the performance was surreal. Las Vegas had returned to its neon glow, but within the walls of Graceland and hotel suites alike, a reverent silence lingered, a quiet acknowledgement of something extraordinary witnessed, almost sacred. Newspaper headlines did not carry the tones of judgment or fear, but proclaimed a resurrection. "Voice that cannot be silenced," read one. "Elvis defies fate once more," read another. Photographs captured the intensity of the night. Sweat-dampened sequins, a furrowed brow of concentration, a trembling hand holding the microphone. But it was more than an image. It was a symbol, a proof that human resilience could echo louder than mortality. The doctor, the same man who had cautioned against further performances, was summoned for interviews. His voice, normally steady and clinical, faltered as he attempted to articulate the magnitude of what had transpired. Medically speaking, he admitted, it was dangerous beyond reason. But there are forces, will, spirit, that cannot be measured, and last night we saw them in their purest form. He paused, looking down at the folded sheet of notes in his hands, as if the words themselves could not fully contain what he had witnessed. I have never seen such courage, such absolute commitment to music and to people. Letters began arriving at Graceland almost immediately, hundreds of them, handwritten, typed, and pressed with urgency. Fans described how the performance had pierced through personal griefs, healed invisible wounds, and rekindled hope where despair had settled. Your song helped me hold my mother's hand as she passed, one letter began. I never thought I would feel joy again, but hearing you sing reminded me that life still matters. Another read, I cried through the entire performance, but it was the first time I felt proud to feel. The collection of voices formed a mosaic of human experience, an affirmation that art, when carried with truth, could become a lifeline. Amidst this wave of adoration, the team around Elvis continued to worry. The physical toll of the performance was undeniable. His body had been stretched to its limits, and every movement required careful calculation, every breath measured against pain and fatigue. Yet even as the doctors urged rest, Elvis's resolve remained unshaken. He sat alone in his room, staring out at the horizon where city lights met the darkening desert, contemplating the precarious balance of life, art, and love. The weight of mortality was a constant companion, but it had not silenced the fire within. In private moments, he reflected on his daughter, Lisa Marie, and her innocent questions that had haunted him since the last phone call. Would he be there for her birthday? Would he witness milestones he had promised to cherish? Guilt mingled with pride as he realized the precariousness of life, how fragile the threads of presence and absence truly were. And yet, he also recognized that the legacy he was crafting was not just for fame or applause. It was for connection, for the shared understanding that even imperfect, struggling humanity could create moments of transcendence. The next weeks were a blend of quiet reflection and measured engagement with the world. Public appearances were minimized, interviews carefully controlled, and each performance was meticulously prepared to safeguard his health without diluting the raw intensity that defined his art. Friends and colleagues observed him closely, noting both the physical fragility and the unyielding strength in his presence. "He carries the weight of thousands in his chest," one confidant noted, "and yet he bends neither knee nor voice to it." This balance of vulnerability and authority became his defining presence, a paradox that only deepened the reverence of those around him. In intimate conversations with friends, he spoke rarely, but with piercing clarity. "I cannot promise how long this body will hold," he admitted one evening, "but while it beats, I will sing. That is all I have. That is all I am." The simplicity of the statement belied its depth. He understood that art was not a luxury, nor fame a reward, but a responsibility to continue giving light in a world often clouded by darkness. Each note, each performance, each song was a conscious act of defiance against the inevitability that stalked him. As weeks turned to months, the public narrative solidified. Elvis was no longer merely a performer. He was a symbol, a testament to resilience and devotion. Critics who had predicted decline now wrote of triumph. Observers spoke of courage, and fans absorbed every trace of his presence as a reminder of hope, of endurance, and of human potential. The aura of those performances lingered like an echo in the collective consciousness, a melody woven into the lives of those who had witnessed it. Finally, in a quiet moment surrounded by those closest to him, Elvis allowed himself to articulate what the journey had meant. "When my time comes," he said softly, almost as a prayer, "I want them to remember that I sang to the very end, that I faced everything, every warning, every fear, and still chose to sing. Not for glory, not for applause, but because it was the only way I knew to be alive. That is what matters. That is all that matters." There was no dramatics, no showmanship, only honesty, a final reflection of a man who had walked the narrow line between mortality and artistry, and had done so with a courage that would echo long after his voice had faded. The story of that night, and the nights that followed, became legend, not as a tale of survival, but as a living example of what is possible when willpower, artistry, and heart converge. The audience, the world, and even his most critical observers came to understand that Elvis's voice was not just sound. It was life itself, vibrating with the resolve of a spirit unwilling to yield. And in that understanding, his legacy was cemented, not merely as a singer, but as a human being who embraced the full measure of existence, knowing the risks, yet choosing love, art, and connection above all. In the end, the final curtain was not a conclusion, but a testament. Elvis had demonstrated that the true measure of greatness lies not in fame or fortune, but in the courage to face limits and defy them with honesty, passion, and unwavering heart. Listeners and witnesses alike were left with a complex, exquisite blend of awe, empathy, and inspiration. A reminder that some voices, no matter the trials, simply cannot be silenced.